And then stay in a meditative mode for a few more minutes. Let's just shift our attention now from the breath to a brief contemplative meditation to cultivate our motivation. So begin just by recognizing, here I am, a human being, alive today, this moment. And so what's my purpose, my intention, my motivation? Life doesn't last forever. I don't know how long my life will last. So what's my intention? What's my motivation? What's in my heart? So we can recall, right? Um, Fundamentally, in this most basic way, I want to be happy. I want not to suffer. Everyone else, right? All the people in this class, all the people who live near me, all the people who live far from me, all the non-human beings, right? We're all the same in wanting to be happy and not wanting to suffer. In a way, all the Buddhas, you could say, assert this idea, right? That the only reasonable, in that basic existential situation that we find ourselves in, the most reasonable, you could say, motivation is compassion. There's love, wishing for all beings, including oneself, to have happiness, and compassion, wishing for all beings, including himself and all others, to be free from suffering. Which if I, and also if I'm, so first of all, that's the most reasonable motivation. And also, if I check my own experience, it's totally clear that if I only focus on my own well-being and happiness, I actually don't find happiness. Whereas cherishing others with love gives others happiness and also brings happiness to myself. Because it's the nature of things that my well-being and others' well-being are interdependent. Others' well-being depends on me. My well-being depends on them. Like taking care of myself wisely is a prerequisite for taking care of others. Taking care of the well-being of others is also a prerequisite for my own well-being. And there is no well-being without love, without compassion, without kindness. And the Buddha's assert the ultimate expression of love and compassion is Bodhichitta. The wish to become a Buddha, because what is a Buddha? Right? Buddha is that kind of being who's fulfilled their own aims and is optimally capable of fulfilling the needs and the aims of others. So the motivation for this day, for this class, is that born of love, born of compassion. On a simple level, we could say the wish to learn a little bit more about how best to take care of myself and others, right? By understanding the mind. Ultimately, to become enlightened, awake, to completely and most effectively fulfill needs and aims of myself and others. With that in mind, we can recite a verse of Refuge and Bodhichitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Nice to see everybody. Let's start this new series of classes. And I should probably start just with a little bit of orientation to what we're doing. And one point I want to make is, as we go along, obviously I'll pause to ask if people have questions, but if you have questions, just like raise your hand or whatever, the purpose is it's fine. The goal is to interact around the material. And then that was the next thing I was about to bring up is, so we're going to, this we call it mind and awareness, right? Is what FPMT's label for this series of, and there's actually two parts. So the first part is awareness and knowers. And anyway, the reason why I'm saying that is that we're going to first, our basic text, our core text for this first part of this first part of this series is going to be this one called an explanation of the presentation of objects and object possessors, as well as awareness and knowers by Purbachok. And so I think, Roy, did you just share that in the chat? Okay, so I emailed it out to some folks, but I wasn't sure if I didn't have everybody's email. And so anyway, it's there in the chat, and you can, download it and read it and, use it as you like. And I am not going to go into great detail, but I was just actually Purbachok or Purbachok Jampa Gyatso, or Ocean of Love is his name. I won't go into huge detail, but just in brief, he actually, I was thinking about this. He would have been like the same generation roughly as Thomas Jefferson's grandfather. So he was a Tibetan Lama, who lived in the early part of the 1700s. He was a great scholar and also a yogi who lived for a long time. He set up a kind of complex, well, he started off just meditating in a cave and then sort of set up a complex of where yogis lived. But I was just reading a little bit. He would go down and sort of have lunch and talk with the 7th Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama. So he was quite a famous scholar. Anyway, and the only thing I'll say about it was he was connected to Sarah J. Monastic University. And so I think that must be why. You'll notice most of the basic program texts are connected to Sarah J, because FPMT is connected to Sarah J, because Lama Yeshe was from Sarah J, and Lama Zopa Rinpoche was also, he actually didn't, in Tibet, as a young person, he didn't go to Sarah J, but he was studying at a monastery that Eventually, he would have gone to Sergei, but then Tibet was invaded, so he had to escape. But then once he escaped and was at the refugee camp, he was sort of studied with Sergei lamas because that was where his monastery would have fed lamas too. So anyway, so and this text is part of, it would be like, actually, if you think of like awareness and knowers, it really is, it's connected to the topic, first of all, of pramana, right, which we're going to talk about. Pramana is like, sometimes, I guess I'll use the translation, there are different translations for it, but I think I'll call it valid cognition. Which sometimes we talk about as like the teachings on logic and also epistemology. Epistemology is like, how do we know what we know, right? And do we know, and how do we know what we know, and is what we think we're knowing correct or not? And these are topics, actually, I just want to point this out, which I think, first of all, oftentimes Buddhists, I was reflecting on this, like, I don't think this, on the one hand, to some extent, these topics aren't studied that much in America, right? Buddhist logic and Buddhist epistemology and Buddhist pramana teachings. And so I thought just to say that, in the Buddhist, I would say in general, in Buddhist traditions, they're humongously important. Actually, it was funny, and I mean, they're humongously important in the Tibetan tradition. But actually, I was just reading a story of like a Chinese Buddhist master from the 600s, and he walked all the way from, China to Tibet and studied pramana, at Nalanda, at monastic university. So there's a long tradition of studying pramana. And sometimes the Dalai Lama often points out, like that, in the early time when Buddhism was coming to Tibet, right? Shantarakshita was one of the early Buddhist masters who came from Nalanda, who came to Tibet to share Buddhism, and he was a great master of pramana and also of Madhyamaka. And the Dalai Lama, I don't know if you all have heard him describe this. He says Tibetans have this metaphor of like two lions kind of chained together, and he said so. No one can get close in a way to that. And the metaphor that Tibetans are using there is that they linked their study of pramana to their study of Madhyamaka, and that when you do that, then you have a kind of fierce wisdom, is the idea, fierce understanding that's that you can't lose, or that will be, that you'll have a deep understanding that won't be able to be overthrown in a way. So they study both, like pramana and Madhyamaka. And here we're going to study, these teachings come from the pramana teachings. They're kind of, actually, this text though would have been studied by a young, it's kind of fun actually to think about this. In the monastery, it would, at Sera, so Sera's a monastery, it would be very young monks actually would be studying this text and learning it. So it's kind of a primer or an introductory text on later they would go on to study other longer texts on pramana, which we won't study because they're longer. So I was thinking just to say a few more things about pramana studies. And one point I wanted to make is, a few of you were in the previous series of classes, which was on Buddhist tenet systems, right? The four schools of Buddhist tenets. These are not Tibetan schools, they're from India, but Tibetans use the terms anyway. But one reason I'm bringing that up is that Tibetan monks, when they study nuns, when they study Sautantrika, when they study pramana, they mainly study it from a Sautantrika perspective. So among tenet systems, I'm just kind of orienting for those of you who are familiar with this kind of thing, that we're going to study this from a Sautantrika perspective because that's how the Tibetans study it. And that's because some of the main texts written by Dharmakirti and Dignaga were written from that perspective. And so we're going to kind of become Sautantrikas as we study this. And what that means, actually, just to make it clear what I'm talking about in a way, is that there are different schools of Buddhist philosophy, right? And they have different assumptions about reality. Some are more subtle. They're all Buddhist and they're all, in a way, correct. But some are more subtle and some are less subtle. And part of the idea here is that when studying Sautantrika, and you're going to see you'll see what I'm getting at here as we go along, is that it's not the most subtle of Buddhist philosophical tenets. And that's good. Because actually, as I think about it, I'll just share my own reflection. When I'm studying this material and really wanting to practice it, you may find this. It's actually maybe in some ways more well suited to my own level of practice. So in other words, it's great to study Madhyamaka, but Madhyamaka is extremely subtle, right? This is coming from a slightly less subtle set of assumptions. And if you understand this well, it'll be much easier to understand Madhyamaka, actually. That's one point for sure. So if you understand this material well, it definitely helps you understand Madhyamaka if you're interested in that. And what is pramana? So I just thought to share like one point is, I'm going to read a quote from, this is from Dharmakirti's Pramana Vartika. Dharmakirti is one of the great Indian Buddhist masters of this topic. And he said, through discernment of that which is factual, that which is not, and that which is to determine that which is not factual and that which is not factual, one depends upon inferential cognizers. So what does that mean? What that means is that one has to use inference oftentimes, right? So one has to use logic. One has to use inference, logical deduction, to determine what's true and what's not true, right? And that, I'm just bringing this up because this is a basic fundament that came from him, and he's the sort of greatest author in the tradition. So what this is getting at is that, you know, as Buddhists, and this kind of, you know, I'm aware. I mean, actually, Lama Tsongkhapa was a great advocate for logic, for reason, for contemplation. And he said, you know, he was aware even in his time, and I just want to bring it up because it's still true in our time, that sometimes, Lama Tsongkhapa pointed out, sometimes in his time there were Buddhist teachers who said, don't think. And I sometimes joke, if you look on, like, if you type into like Google Buddhist memes, you'll find like cartoons where people are still saying what Lama Tsongkhapa was criticizing in the 1400s, right? You know, they'll picture a monk and say, don't, you know, some kind of joke about don't think anything. And Lama Tsongkhapa was very clear in saying that's not what Buddhism is saying. Buddhism isn't saying space out and don't think about anything, right? That what the Buddhist teachings are saying, and this is what Dharmakirti here is saying, is no, actually, if you're going to determine for yourself which of your own thoughts and ways of viewing the world are factual or correct, and which are not, right, which are deluded, then you have to have a way, you know, and in Buddhism, the way they say is it's not enough to rely upon scriptures, right? You can't just say, well, the Buddha said. You have to analyze it for yourself, right? And that's hard work. I just want to point this out, right? That's the real work, I think, of Buddhism, right? Of Buddhist practice. And actually, and also just of being, to some extent, of being a good human being, isn't it? Is to look at what are my beliefs? What are how I view the world? What are my conceptions? Which are true and which are not true, right? And I mean, we know this, right? It's really easy. We all do this, isn't it? It's so easy to look at other people and say, oh, they have really foolish, or they're wrong, or they have wrong ideas, or they have wrong views, or they have wrong understandings. And that's always been true, you know, and right, I often think this, like, as a, you know, in the last few years, it's even more in our culture prominent, isn't it? That it's easy to focus on what's incorrect in others' cognitions and others' worldviews, and that's normal and all that. But Buddhist practice is primarily about looking at one's own, right? Is actually asking yourself, what is my view? How am I viewing this situation? And is it true? Is my view correct or is it incorrect? And in what ways is it correct? And in what ways is it incorrect? Sometimes it's partly correct and partly incorrect, right? So you have to check. And that's what that's what these teachings are about. So that's what we're going to explore in this first part. This first half of this module is, how do you look at your own mind, right? At your own assumptions, at your own beliefs, at your own views of things. And then how do you check? How do you check up, right? On, is how I'm viewing and approaching things correct or incorrect? And actually, this is the real reason, right, for meditation, isn't it? In other words, we often say, "Oh, Buddhists meditate," but actually, I'll just share a story. I remember once I was very into Buddhism in college, and when I was graduating college, I spoke to a lama I knew at the time, Geshe, and he said, "What do you think of doing after you graduate?" And I said, oh, I think I'm going to go do like some retreat, some meditation retreat. And he sort of like chuckled and he said, well, that'll be a complete waste of time. And I was young and excited, and I looked at him and I said, like, what? I thought lamas are supposed to be happy if you're going to go off and meditate. And he said, you don't know anything yet. What are you going to do? Like, you'll just sit there? And I thought, well, I just spent, a few years in college studying. Some part of my studies were Buddhist studies. And he was correctly pointing out, well, you don't know anything yet. It'll be a waste of time. And then actually I went and double checked a couple of years later. I went in the call with Lama Zopa Rinpoche. I said the same thing. I said, wouldn't it be good if I went up and meditated? He said, no, that would be a waste of time. If you did a long retreat, good to meditate, but don't, you have to learn first, otherwise you don't know what you're meditating on. And then you waste your time, because part of the point is the goal of there are two goals of meditation in a way. One is contemplative meditation, right? One type of meditation is contemplation. That's where you're doing what we're describing here. You analyze things, right? To come to correct conclusions about them. The other kind of meditation is what they sometimes call calm abiding, right? Or fixed meditation. And that's where you focus on one object. There you're not analyzing. But the problem is if you haven't come to a correct conclusion and you do fixed meditation, you're fixing sometimes on the wrong object, right? So if you have a wrong idea and then you focus on that, you're actually just habituating yourself more deeply to a wrong idea. Does that make sense? So the idea in Buddhist meditation actually is that there is fixed meditation where you're not analyzing, but you're supposed to fix your mind to something correct, something healthy, something reasonable, something that's in line with reality, right? And so if we don't know how to analyze what's in line with reality, then our meditation is going to be less useful to us, right? Because the whole idea of Buddhist meditation, right? One is undermining wrong ideas, right? And cultivating correct ideas. And that's where I was going to read one more quote, and then I'm going to stop the orientation. I actually went to the text, but here's probably the most famous quote, or one of the most famous quotes in the Buddhist Pramana teachings comes from Dignaga, and there's a whole chapter of Dharmakirti's Pramanavartika that's just a commentary to this one verse. But here's the verse, I'll just read it to you. Dignaga said, and this is interesting, he's describing the Buddha, and this is what I'm going to read the first half, or not the first half, but the first, the beginning clause of the sentence. He says, this is how he starts his praise to the Buddha, Dignaga. He says, to one who has become pramana. Right? And pramana means valid cognition, right? So to one who's become valid, or some translators call it authoritative or something, but I think valid is actually a good translation, right? So he praises the Buddha as the Buddha is one who has become valid, right? Meaning that the Buddha is somebody who's overcome all mistaken understandings, right? And only sees things as they are, right? So that's the beginning of his praise to the Buddha is, he says, to one who has become pramana, right? Pramana is valid cognition. So the Buddha sees everything as it is, right? With no incorrect views. And then he says, he goes on, he says, the one who wishing to benefit others, the teacher, the one gone to bliss, the protector, I bow down. Right? So he's describing what is the Buddha there, right? The Buddha is somebody who's become valid, who wishes to benefit others, right? Who has compassion and love, a teacher. And then it's interesting, one gone to bliss and a protector. Anyway, there's a humongous amount of commentary that one could give to that verse, and I'm not going to do that. But I just want to point out one more point about this, because it's radical, actually. And it's implied in Dignaga's quote here, right? He says that the Buddha has become pramana, has become valid, right? Has overcome wrong views and has gained wisdom, right? That's wisdom. Right? And then he calls him a sugata, meaning one gone to bliss. And the point I want to make there is there's an implication there, which I think is interesting in Buddhism, which is that, actually, Bob Thurman has a new book out, the title of which is Wisdom is Bliss. And this quote implies that truth, doesn't it? In other words, that the idea in Buddhism is if you become realistic, or if your understanding of reality becomes closer and closer to the way things are, you also become blissful, right? And a Buddha is one who is what they call him that, a Sugata, one God, or her. Buddha can also be female, right? But a Buddha is one gone to bliss, and a Buddha is one who has become wise or prominent, right? One who has become valid. So there's a fundamental idea there, which is as you get closer and closer to, as you get, as your view gets more and more realistic, as you become more in tune with reality, you also become more blissed out. And the extent to which we suffer is because of our ignorance, right? It's a fundamental Buddhist idea. So these teachings on pramana are about how do you liberate yourself from suffering and become blissful. And actually, and it's an interesting point, right? Because you can't lead others to bliss if you're not blissful, right? And you can't free others from suffering if you're still caught in delusion. You can't help somebody else become liberated from much. You can help a little, right? And that's what we're doing here, I guess, trying to help each other a little bit. But in the end, we have to become pramana, right? We have to become, our perceptions need to become valid. And in that way, we go to bliss, is one point. Go to freedom, liberation from suffering. So that's just like a little bit of orientation to the material. And then maybe what I'm thinking I'll do is I'll just start I'll just start in on the text itself. Start with this text, and then we'll kind of explore it and ask questions and discuss it a bit. I don't know. So I don't know how much to focus on this. I mean, it's just quite nice. The Purba starts with, he says, I bow down to the Lama and to the protector Manju Gosha, right? So he bows to his teacher, right? And he bows to Manjushri, the Buddha of wisdom, right? Which makes sense because we're exploring teachings on cultivating wisdom, right? And then he gives the title. By the way, he has a term here. We'll go. I'll just start with part one, objects. And then he says, in our own system, concerning the first of these two, because he's going to cover objects and object possessors as well as awareness and knowers. Right? And so then he says here, so the first of the two is objects and object possessors. Right. And so I just want to say, what does that mean? Right. So an object here, as we're about to describe, means an existent phenomena. Right. An object means an object, but yeah, an object is an existent phenomena, right? Or actually, some objects, as we're going to explore, some objects of cognition are non-existence, right? So because sometimes we'll explore that in a minute. Sometimes what our consciousness is engaging with, the object of our cognition, it exists as the object of a cognition, but it doesn't exist, right? The traditional Buddhist example would be the horns of a rabbit, right? You can think of the horns of a rabbit, you can imagine them, but they don't actually exist. Right. So an object, I guess technically here, can be an existent thing, or sometimes objects of cognition can be non-existent things too. And a self, for example, a self-sufficient, substantially existent self of persons is an object of cognition. It's something we cognize, but it doesn't actually exist. John just asked. So John, we're using Purba text, which is in the chat. Which I emailed to you. I know I emailed it to you. So Purba text, explanation of the presentation of objects and object possessors, as well as of awareness and knowers. And then object possessors, well, we'll get into what that is actually in this text. So, but object possessors, in one sense, actually, I just want to point something out here, which is, and this is just really, I think, right, has deep implications. Is what they're getting at here is that objects and object possessors have an interdependent nature, don't they? Right. So I'm going to give an example, right? A cognition, an example of an object would, if you were to look at a car, right? The car would be the object. And if you're looking with your eyes, the object possessor would be eye consciousness, right? And the reason I'm saying that is that already it's implying something, isn't it? Which we're going to get into in a second, but is that those two things that are interdependent, right? The object that you're seeing and the consciousness seeing it are two interdependent things in that experience, which has a lot of implications in Buddhist thought, doesn't it? In this idea of interdependence. But anyway, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. So So he says here, he's going to cover objects and possessors. And then he says, what is an object? It is that which is known by an awareness. And I just want to pause there. What do you think of that? Right? So an object, right? Then we're going to get into what are the types of objects. But what do you think of that idea? That an object is that which is known by an awareness. Is that how you think of reality? Do you notice, right, like in that definition of object, that actually, like, so for you, I'll just ask, like in your own personal sort of view, right, are there objects that are not objects of awareness? Right? It's an interesting question, at least, to contemplate. Or is there something, and actually, like, because, you know, if you really, like, and what would that mean, right? Like, so, you know, yeah, what would that even mean, right? Something's an object, but it's not an object of awareness. So it's implying something, right? For something to exist, it's an object of awareness. Anyway, my point here is that's what you have to, like, it's worth contemplating these points and asking yourself, do I agree with that? What does that mean? What are the implications? Anyway, I'll leave it there and people can ask questions after. So I want to go through just the three types. It says here, when object is divided, there are, and then he gives three types of objects. I want to describe what they are, and then maybe we'll pause to discuss a little bit. So number one, appearing objects. And let me grab this. So I want to point this. So the appearing object, and sometimes this is called the apprehended object. So the appearing object is that which appears to the mind or consciousness, right? That which appears to an awareness or consciousness. And in order to understand what we're getting at here, I have to point something out. I have to explain something about this, which is to understand these three types of objects, you have to understand that in this in Pramana teachings, there are two types of awarenesses. One is direct perception. Right? And direct perception is a non-conceptual knower. Oh, there's more to it than that, which we'll get into, but in brief, direct perception is non-conceptual. And what appears to a direct perception, according to this tenet system, is a functioning thing, a thing itself, right? So like, I'll hold this up, right? If you look at, with your eye consciousness, pen, right? Your eye consciousness is at first glance, can non-conceptually see the shape, right? And colors of a pen. And in that sense, the appearing object to your eye consciousness is pen, right? And you're seeing it without conceptuality at first, right? And so that's a direct perception. And now comes the trick. So one type of consciousness, we're going to simplify here for a moment, are direct perceivers, right? And those see without conceptuality, and they see actual functioning things. Then there's another type of knower, or of awareness, conscious, which is conceptual, right? And so actually now, like, okay, so like, you see, like your eye consciousness sees the pen, and now, like, you can think of a pen, right? And can you tell the difference? Like, I'm just going to ask you to think about it for a moment. What's the difference between when your eye consciousness directly perceives a pen, and when when you have a conceptual consciousness knowing pen? You get the question at least, right? Like, one is your idea of pen, and one is a direct perception of pen. Right? So now, actually, it's very deep, and you see we're starting to get just the very beginning. You start to get deep, right? So the appearing object, right? For a direct perceiver, you see what I'm getting at? Like the appearing object is, they say is a functioning thing or is a thing itself, right? You could say a functioning thing. So it's what appears to your, like if you touch something, right? Right? It's that. It's what it's if I touch my computer, right? Right now, do that. Right. It's so there's a tactile consciousness tactile awareness or consciousness that feels, right? That feels something. There's a visual consciousness, the auditory consciousness, and so on. So for those, the appearing object is a functioning impermanent phenomenon, right? And that's important. That phenomenon that appears to that kind of consciousness is something that functions, right? Computer works, right? A pen works as a pen, and even when it doesn't work as a pen, you can use it for something else, right? You could use it as whatever. So you can use the parts of it for something. Whereas then think about a conceptual consciousness, right? So the appearing object to a conceptual consciousness is, and this is a technical term, in the technical term they use is meaning generality, but we could say a mental image, to put it simply, right? Is a mental image. And one point is that I just want to point out is check for yourself about this. Like, it's just interesting, since I've done this before, but since preparing to teach this today, I was sort of just going, as I would go around doing things like, brushing my teeth this morning, or whatever, eating breakfast, right? You can start to go, wow, like, do I ever notice the difference between the actual Cheerios and my idea of Cheerios? Or whatever, right? The actual toothbrush and my mental image of toothbrush. What's the difference between them? And do I notice the difference? And that's not, and I want to point out, like, like my mental image of a toothbrush and the actual toothbrush, that's a correct, that's a correct conceptual cognition. In other words, I'm not confused about the nature of toothbrush, right? So it's not that, but just to notice that it's not identical to the toothbrush is one point. Okay, so going back, the appearing object, right, which is in the text. The appearing object to a non-conceptual direct perceiver, right, is an impermanent functioning thing. The appearing object to a conceptual consciousness is a mental image. And I want to point out a couple of things now that Buddhists say about mental images. The Buddhist philosophy says about mental images, or what do I call it? A generic image, or whatever. There are different terms that different translators have used. Meaning generality was the term I used. But anyway, probably mental image is an easier English language term. One point is a mental image is not a functioning thing in the sense that it doesn't perform a function by itself. Like, so, for example, like, this is obvious, isn't it? My mental image of Cheerios won't make me less hungry, right? Or provide calories. My mental image of a toothbrush won't keep me from getting cavities by itself, right? And that's one way. Actually, one way they sometimes put it is that in this tenet system is that a functioning thing, right, a functioning impermanent thing changes instant by instant and can perform a function from its own side. Whereas a mental image does not change instant by instant, and a mental image does not perform a function from its own side. Like, so, and I'll give another example, a seed, right? Like the seed of a tomato plant, right? The seed of a tomato plant, by its very nature, is impermanent instant by instant, and can produce, under the right conditions, can produce a tomato plant. It depends on cause and conditions, but from its own side, it can serve as the primary cause of a tomato plant. My mental image of a tomato seed is not changing instant by instant. It's not a functioning thing in that way, and I can't plant it somewhere and have it grow into a tomato plant. Right? It won't happen. It won't perform a function from its own side. Yeah. So those are some points about appearing objects. So do you get the idea, though? So the core idea here, what we're actually getting at in these three types of objects, is that there's a difference between, and that there's an experiential, lived difference that's quite important between conceptual and non-conceptual, direct perceivers, which are non-conceptual, and then conceptual consciousnesses. And they have a different kind of appearing object, right? Direct perceivers have appearing object as an actual functioning, impermanent, by instant phenomena. And the appearing object of a conceptual consciousness is a mental image, which is not a functioning thing from its, it doesn't function, doesn't produce effects from its own side, and it doesn't change instant by instant. Maybe I'll pause there before going on. Does anybody have any questions about that up to now? Because actually, those are important, like fundamental ideas in this system to then go on. Anybody have any questions? I mean, I can keep going, but I just want to pause in case it's confusing. Good? Okay. Yeah, if you have, as I said, if you have a question, feel free to drop. Now, the second, this list, right? As I said, there's a list of three things here, objects divided into three. So the second one is determined object. And what this is getting at is quite simple. Determined objects are only applied to conceptual consciousnesses. And what they're getting at there, so there is no determined object for a non-conceptual consciousness. The non-conceptual, because the non-conceptual consciousness directly gets at what it touches or what it perceives. But here, what they're getting at with the determined object idea is that for a conceptual consciousness, there's this mental image that appears, right? But that mental image is determining something about a thing itself, right? A functioning thing, an impermanent phenomenon. And so you could say determined objects only exist in relation to conceptual consciousnesses. And they're what that, you could say they're what that conceptual consciousness is getting at, or what it, what it's getting at, what it's determining something about. Right? So like, and again, just to put it simply, like, if my appearing object like if I think, okay, my toothbrush is in the toothbrush holder in the bedroom or in the bathroom by the bedroom now, right? That's a mental image, right? But its determined object is the actual toothbrush that's there because I left it there, right? And there's a difference between those two. So a conceptual consciousness can have one appearing object, which is the mental image, and then its determined object is the thing that that mental image is about or is a representation of. And then the last of these three is the object of engagement. And maybe, and that's, to put it simply, the object of engagement is, actually, I'm going to use the actual quote here. So, the object of engagement is the same as the, oh, I don't want to use that term. Okay. So the object of engagement is the object the mind is actually engaging with. And we'll explore what that means. That's just the way they define it, but I'm going to actually, or the way they describe it. But I'm going to keep going and it'll make it clear. So I'll just keep going in the text here and I'll make it clear. So the appearing object of a particular awareness and the apprehended object of that awareness are synonymous. I'm just trying to think which order to present this in. Maybe this is a simple way to, actually, well, maybe I'll put it this way, to put it simply. What they're getting at in terms of, maybe I'll finish about object engagement. I was going to cover it in the order they do it, but it's better to kind of clarify it now. The real point here is this. The real point they're getting at is that for a direct perceiver, the appearing object and the object of engagement are the same, right? So in other words, the mind, if the appearing object to a direct perceiver of pen and the object of engagement for a direct perceiver is still pen, right? It's the pen itself. Whereas for a conceptual consciousness, they're not the same, right? The appearing object is the mental image of pen. The object of engagement is the actual pen, or is the impermanent functioning pen. So so you see what I'm getting at there? Like for non-conceptual direct perceivers, the appearing object and the object of engagement are the same thing. Whereas for a conceptual consciousness, they're not the same, right? Yeah, I have a concept of a thing, and then the object that the object I'm engaging with is not the concept, it's the actual thing. It's the impermanent phenomenon. I want to keep going with the text, but I actually want to pause there. I'm kind of curious, like, so this is kind of, I mean, I get that this is a little technical, right? It's a little, what's the word? Conceptual. I'm curious if you pause for a moment, like, first of all, it's easy with a pen, right? In other words, you can get the sense of that, right? Your eye conscious seeing a pen, and then that's different from your idea of pen, right? And actually, like, your idea of pen began when you were in school, right? You learned about pen, well, right before that when you were a kid and so on. But part of the idea here, right, is that what I said our conceptual consciousnesses are not changing instant by instant. So you could say they're like our fixed ideas. You know, we often say that, right? I have fixed ideas about something. And yeah, fixed ideas, or yeah. And what I want to ask you is this, just to think about for a moment, is just for a minute now, and this, I want to be clear, I'm not getting at emptiness here, and I'm not even getting at selflessness. But I just want to try something like a momentary exercise, which is first, take a moment and actually like look at your hand and touch your own knee, right? Just do that. Like, look at your hand and touch your own knee. That's direct perception, right? Visual consciousness, you see your hand, touch your knee, right? That's a tactile, right? That's a direct perception of your own body, right? Of body. Now, think for a moment, who are you? Right? And do you feel the difference? Do you notice the difference, right? And do you see how, like, our ideas of who we are include these, like, fixed ideas, right? Like, and they're what's the word? They're mental images, they're labels, they're terms, right? Oftentimes terms and images that go together, right? Like, are you? And actually, what comes up for you, right? Like, what comes up for you if you say, "Who are you?" And then go back again, right? Like, touch your hands together. Direct perception. And this is just I'm just doing the most simple level of starting to just notice the difference, right? Experientially. And do you start to, And then ask yourself a question, like, do you have, and if you're honest with yourself, probably most likely the answer will be yes, I think. But do you have any self-concepts that sometimes come up that are inaccurate? Do you ever think anything about yourself that's not quite accurate and not quite helpful? And do you see what we're getting at here? That's a mental image. Right? And that's different from a direct perception. Right? Direct perception, right, is very, in one way, is quite simple. Right? It's like your five senses, right? For the most part, as we're using it here. There's other versions of direct perception that we can get to, yogic direct perception. That's not relevant to this part. Like, so just start to notice that, right? Okay, what's my direct perception of myself, right? Like touch, sight, if you look in the mirror, sound, right? You can hear your own voice, so on, right? And then what are my mental images of myself? And this is prominence. Actually, I'm gonna go out of order now. Just because it's kind of, I said earlier that it's an example here. Okay, I said earlier from the text, right? An object is that which is known by awareness, right? Remember I said that, right? It goes definition of object. This is part of, I'm going to go a little deeper into pramana now. Like, that means, according to Buddhist logical assertions, that there need to be 8 what they call pervasions to exist between those two things. So object and that which is known by awareness have to have 8 different, they call them pervasions, which I'll describe what those mean. Actually, maybe I'll do it about that. And then I want to use the same 8 pervasions about your self-image. Okay, I'm warning you now. That's what we're going to do. Or whatever self-image. So remember the self-image that causes you some suffering. We all have some of those, I think. But I'm going to first do the 8 pervasions about, just to give something more generic, more or less charged, right? Object and that which is known by awareness. What Buddhist logical, Buddhist pramana, I'll say, Buddhist pramana teachings are saying is, I just said that's the definition of object. So they're saying, if that's the definition of object, then there need to be 8 pervasions. And what does that mean? It means that the first 2 are a pervasion of being. So it means whatever is A is B, and whatever is B is A. So that means whatever is an object must be known by awareness, and whatever is known by awareness must be an object. That's not enough yet for this to be an effective definition. There also has to be a pervasion of existing. That means where there's A, there's B, and where there's B, there's A. So wherever there is an object, there is that which is known by awareness, and wherever there is something that's known by awareness, there's an object. There's no exceptions. Then there has to be a pervasion of not being. That means wherever there is no object, there's nothing known by awareness, and wherever nothing is known by awareness, there's no object. And then the last 2, a pervasion of not existing. That means, I'm sorry, the first one was whatever is not A, is not B. The next one is wherever. So whatever is not an object cannot be known by awareness, and whatever cannot be known by awareness is not an object. It's not an object of existence. It's not an existing object. And the last one is wherever, right? So wherever there is no object, there's nothing known by awareness, and wherever there is nothing known by awareness, there's no object. So if something has those 8 pervasions, then it's a correct definition, right? So that's a very thorough analysis. And so that's how a Buddhist contemplator, right, meditator, would analyze that. Now I want to ask you though, so take your own self-image. Take that aspect, not your whole self-image, because that's too complicated, but pick one aspect of your own self-image for a moment, right? I'm like this. Particularly one that causes you some suffering. I'm talking about something gross here. I'm not talking about selflessness. I'm just talking about like, what's a fixed idea you have about yourself? And what I'll ask you is, right, what this logical question is asking is, well, if that idea you have of yourself is true, right, then every instant of your appearance has to include that truth, right? And whenever and wherever you are, that has to be your nature, right? And there can't be a moment of exception, right? Like when you're in deep sleep and not dreaming, that has to be true of you. Otherwise, it's not identical with you. I'm just pointing out, right, these are the kinds of questions one might ask from these, so what I'm going back to, why are we raising these kinds of things about appearing object versus object of engagement and so on, is in order to start to recognize in our own experience, oh, wow, okay, what are my direct perceptions and what are my conceptual ways of knowing, right? And then we can start to go, okay, so those are my direct perceptions according to this tenet system are, if they're, as long as they're not a wrong consciousness, are correct. But our conceptual consciousness can be correct or incorrect. Right? Anyway, I'll get more into that in a second, but just want to start with that, right? So one point we're getting at here is one value of knowing about these kinds of objects is to then start to check for yourself. Wow, okay, what's my appearing object now? What's appearing to my awareness? Then you can start to ask, well, is what's appearing to my awareness, what was the term we used here? Remember the first quote I gave from the Brahman of Arctica? I'm going to go back and re-say it again now. Through discernment of that which is factual and that which is not factual, we depend upon inferential cognition, right? So through inferential cognition, we can determine which of our conceptions are factual and which are non-factual. First, we have to know what's a conception, right? What is a conceptual knower? Right? Then we can start to ask the question, is it valid or not? And that question gets directly at, are we suffering? Do we suffer, or how much do we suffer? And let's see, there are so many different points. I want to make one more point here, just in general, and then we'll go back to the text. And this is about conceptual consciousnesses. And I wrote down my own point to make sure I say it correctly. Conceptual consciousnesses, and this is going to be humongously important just in general, not just for this class, but in Buddhist, if you want to understand Buddhist philosophy in general, this point is very important in all different systems, this kind of contemplation. Conceptual consciousnesses are all mistaken with respect to their appearing objects because they mistake the mental image or meaning generality for the thing itself. However, they are not all wrong consciousnesses. Pramana or valid conceptual consciousnesses are correct regarding their objects of engagement. And now you get the difference between the appearing object and the object of engagement, I hope. So I'm going to say that, I'm going to go back over that one more time, because I think it's a hard concept, but it's humongously important. And this is, you'll hear, if you listen to Buddhist teachings, you'll sometimes hear this. This is a mistaken consciousness, but it's not a wrong consciousness. I remember the first time I heard that, I thought, what in the world are they talking about? How can it be mistaken, but not wrong? This is what they're getting at. So when you have a conceptual consciousness about something, it's mistaken in this specific way. It mistakes your mental image of the object for the object. But the mental image of the object is not the object. To that extent, conceptual consciousnesses are mistaken, right? That's where it regards their appearing object. that which is appearing. But regarding the object of engagement, they're not all wrong consciousnesses. Oftentimes, our conceptual consciousnesses are correct regarding their object of engagement, right? In the sense that if I think, like, so, and I'll give a very simple example here. If I think, I can think of my, give the example, I brushed my teeth this morning. I can think, oh, it's good to, my toothbrush is upstairs and it's healthy for me to use it. And I'll be healthier if I brush my teeth, right? That's a correct, that's not a wrong consciousness. That's not a wrong consciousness, right? It's, in other words, a toothbrush is a toothbrush and it's good for our health, right? Or if I think, oh, wow, like if I think, for breakfast, I could have Cheerios or I could have a donut and I'll be healthier if I eat the Cheerios. That would be not a wrong consciousness, right? But to the extent that but it can still be a mistake. It's still a mistaken consciousness in the sense that if I mistake my mental image of Cheerios for Cheerios, it's mistaken to that degree, but it's still not a wrong consciousness. It's correct regarding its object of engagement, which means it's correct regarding the actual function of that thing, right? And the same, I'll give another simple example. I want to go back to seeds, right? If I think of the seed of a tomato plant, and I'm going to give an example of a wrong kind. On the one hand, if I got my seeds mixed up and I thought it was an okra seed, right? That would be a wrong kind. If I think, oh, I'm going to plant this and grow some okra, and I planted it, and then I'm like, oh my goodness, the tomatoes are coming up. That would be a wrong consciousness, right? It will be wrong regarding its object of engagement. I think it's going to function a certain way, but it actually functions a different way, right? That's about the object of engagement. Whereas if I know, oh, this is a tomato seed, I'm going to plant it and water it, I want to grow tomatoes, right? And then I do that, then that's not a wrong, it's not a wrong consciousness, right? It's correct regarding its object of engagement, which means the actual seed itself, right? So we can have correct conceptual consciousnesses about objects of engagement, and we can also have incorrect conceptual consciousnesses about objects of engagement. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Do people, I mean, that I say it in a way where that point is clear? I just want to pause, like, I'll just make it a general point. Like, so to be correct regarding, we can't help it. In other words, about that our appearing object has an element of mistakenness because we mistake it for the thing itself, that we can't help. In other words, until we're, as ordinary sentient beings, we can't help that. That's part of being an ordinary person. If you're an Arya Bodhisattva, it becomes different. You can address that. But for us, that's not a question right now. But I want to address this point about being correct with regards to your object of engagement, right? So we would pause just to contemplate something together for a moment. How many problems in the world arise because we human beings think we're correct regarding our object of engagement, but we're not? Right? That we think we know something about our object of engagement. We think our concept about our object of engagement is correct, but it's not correct. And just think about, I mean, I'm just suggesting just pause, like, it's actually disturbing if you start to ask that question, I find, right? Because, like, and you can, when you think about between nations, right, where you think about in, healthcare, whether you think about gender or race, whether you think about within a family and how we view their family members, whether you think about your neighbors, right? Like, how often do we believe that are, and going back to our terms here, that the appearing object that's appearing to our conceptual consciousness is correct regarding its object of engagement, but we're wrong. And therefore we cause suffering to ourselves and to each other as sentient beings. And so what I'm getting at is, in one way, these terms are terms, right? But they have humongous implications. And one thing that Buddhism is saying is, you can get this right? That's why I started with that, also the quote from Ignaga, right? He praises the Buddha. The Buddha is one who has become valid. Right? A Buddha is somebody who doesn't get it wrong. Right? And therefore doesn't cause themselves and others suffering. And to the extent that we don't know these things in our own experience, we can't help it, right? In other words, if we don't figure out when is my appearing object of conceptual consciousness not correct regarding its object of engagement. And actually, I want to point one more thing, and I'll take that question. But also, it's not as helpful when in other words, like being able to tell when somebody else is wrong doesn't do that much good, does it? It's okay. I mean, I'm not against that and all that. But in Buddhist practice, the main point actually is, when do I get it wrong, right? And I want to say too, like, self-compassion in Buddhism is this. The essence, it's not all of self-compassion, but the one humongously important expression of self-compassion in Buddhism is getting better at telling when I'm wrong for myself, right? And getting it right more. Because, as I said earlier, right, in that quote from Dinaga, to become more close to valid cognition is blissful, liberates us from suffering. And the more we get our cognitions wrong, the more we mistake our conceptual appearing objects when they're actually are mistaken, or not just mistaken, I'm sorry, when they're wrong consciousnesses, but we think they're right consciousnesses. That's how we cause a lot of suffering for ourselves and others. That's one of the ways we do it. And now, John, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I think I understand appearing objects and determined objects. And objects of engagement, it's simply the next lesson, the next stage of a mental image that we're engaging with?
No. So the object of engagement, this is the important part. The object of engagement is, what is the mind actually engaging with? And so, to put it simply, it's not necessarily it's not a mental image, it's actually the thing itself. And so the point is like, with direct perception, the appearing object and the object of engagement are going to be the same thing, right? Like, so, because in other words, what's appearing to your eye consciousness is, say, a pen, and what your consciousness is engaging with is a pen. But with a conceptual consciousness, the appearing object is the mental image of a pen, but the object of engagement is the pen. You're engaging with a pen, but what's appearing to your consciousness in that moment is the mental image of a pen. So they're different. So the object of engagement is what's the actual object that's being engaged with.
So it's back to the physical pen.
Yep.
And then back to the concept of being wrong. Is it because when we have our conceptual consciousness of it, we are actually still, I mean, we may not be looking at the pen, but our conceptual consciousness is still seeing something like this. And that's where we get it wrong?
It's important.
I guess if one of us was a Buddha and we were thinking of a pen, what would we be thinking?
So what this is getting at is this, in a way. It's important to differentiate between mistaken and wrong, in a way. In Buddhist terms, in Buddhist philosophy, we have to make a clear distinction between being mistaken and being wrong, because not all mistaken consciousnesses are wrong. It's kind of interesting. And so, okay, so with your example of a pen, right, that you just gave, like, when you actually look at a pen with your eye consciousness, that's, according to this tenet system, and you recognize, you see pen with your eye, right, your eyes. that's unmistaken, and it's also not wrong. Does that make sense, that point? So in other words, if you see a pen with your visual consciousness, that's unmistaken, and it's also not a wrong consciousness in that sense, because you're seeing it, it's not wrong in that. But now I want to give you an example. Like you asked about wrong, so I'll go to the wrong part. If I were, like, imagine, oh, this happened, like I'm trying to think of a real example. Okay, oh, here's an example. Like actually, well, I think it's might have even happened something like this, where I was on a Zoom call. Shane and I are doing Tibetan lessons with a guy in Dharamsala, and like sometimes he'll hold up an object, and it's a Zoom call, and it's not always clear, and whatever, and I see the wrong, and I don't like, so he'll hold up a if he held, oh yeah, maybe he holds up a pencil, and I say yuku, which is the Tibetan word for pen, and he says wrong. That's not a pen. It's a pencil, you know. And then he says it's Tibetan word for pencil, right? My point is that's a wrong consciousness. So there was that would be a wrong. Well, actually, that'd be a wrong mistake. That would be a wrong direct perception. But a wrong going back. Okay, so what are we getting at? A wrong consciousness is something that is wrong with regards to its object of engagement. So when you held up your pen, if I thought, oh, that's a pencil, that would be a wrong consciousness. Whereas right now, when I think of the pen you held up, I'm not having a direct perception of it, right? I'm thinking of it. I can see in my mind's eye, so to speak, right? Oh, that's John's pen. That is not a wrong consciousness, because I know it's a pen, right? But it's conceptual, and therefore it's mistaken to the extent that it's a mental image of a pen. It's not a pen. Does that make sense? So it's not a wrong consciousness, because I know you held up a pen. It looked like a pen to me. I believe you that it was a pen, not a pencil, for example. So it's not a wrong consciousness, but it's mistaken in that in the moment I don't say that's my mental image of pen. I say that's a pen. I say I think of it and I go, oh, that's John's pen, right? And I don't recognize, no, that's my mental image of John's pen, right? So it's mistaken to that degree, but it's not a wrong consciousness because you do have a pen. And so it's correct regarding its object of engagement, which is your actual pen.
So if you thought it was only a mental image of my pen, then it would not be unmistaken either.
Yeah.
And that's the goal, is to be able to get to that level with all objects, I assume.
Yeah. So not. So actually, what I think Lottie remember saying at one point, he was defining what does it mean to have. Like, in other words, yeah, so what's the word say, right? What Buddhas don't have is, we say something in Mahayana tenets, they say Buddhas are free from conceptuality. And what that means, actually, at one point I was like, what does that mean? I asked Kent Rinpoche a couple of times, like, what does that mean? I couldn't understand it. But now I kind of get it. It's like, what it's saying is Buddhas never confuse. Buddhas don't have any confusion that in thinking that a concept about a thing is a thing itself. And then somebody else had a hand up. I can't remember. Oh, Linda.
I did. Part of what this is making me wonder is whether I ever have access to direct perception.
And what this tenet system would say is yes. There was like, if you see, this tenet system would say, like, for example, if you look at the sky with your eyes, you open your eyes, look outside, and you see blue, like that's a direct perception of blue, and that's a correct. They could say that's a valid direct perception.
Until I start labeling it or thinking about it more.
Yeah, then then it's no longer a direct, And then actually, this school would say. New, they call it, we'll get into this later, but when they talk about pramana, they say a new non-conceptual factually concordant knower, I think, or something like that is the definition. So it would be that first, like the first new moment of, they would say that's pramana, that's completely, according to this tenet system, they would say that's a valid perception. Or if you hear, that first moment of hearing a bird in the morning or something, like, in other words, you hear it, and that's like, there's something very fresh, and it's correct. Your ear consciousness can sort of, that's an example of, that's a valid, so they would say those are valid cognitions that are direct perceptions.
Like the experience. Okay, thank you.
And then Varahi.
Yeah, if you could go back to the determined object, and so I can understand a little more clearly what it is and whether it's the same, for an appearing object, direct perception, not appearing object, direct perception versus conceptual perception.
Okay, so for a determined object, according to this tenet system, direct perceptions, don't have a determined object. So there is no determined object. So determined object is a phrase, or a term that's only used regarding conceptual consciousness. And what it's really getting at is like that, that your concept is determining about something. What's that about? And so so the determined object in general would be the same as the object of engagement. It's what is this determining about? Yeah. And then Lynn had a question.
Well, I was thinking of Varahi's question, and I guess determined object doesn't change, whereas the object of perception is constantly changing.
Say more what you mean. I want to make sure I get it. That was an interesting point, I think.
Well, if you see a bird, the bird changes. I mean, minute to minute, second to second, whatever period of time. But if you have the concept of a bird, it doesn't change. It's fixed.
Right.
So that seems to be a major difference.
That is a huge,
But the question I want to ask is, because it comes up in my work a lot, is it seems like you could have an appearing object, sort of puzzle pieces. This is the way I look at it. So you have a ton of puzzle pieces. And those puzzle pieces are appearing objects. They're physical, you can see them. And then you have a concept in your mind of how they fit together. And that's a fixed object. And it could be wrong and it could be right, but you have it in your mind. So that's sort of a conceptual view of how these pieces fit together. And it could be one of two ways. Either they do fit together, what you have in your mind, or they don't.
That's right. And I think it's a great point you're making. And that's what you're really getting at now. This, like what this whole part of, what this whole topic that we're today starting the study of is exploring. And this is why we have to have these basic, what we're really doing today is sort of getting these basic concepts about it, which which we're getting. I think people are getting it. Is what we're getting at then is, okay, so once you can tell, okay, this is the direct perception, this is my fixed concept about that. How do I analyze? Like, how do I check? It's like, how do I check to see if and what they're saying, I just want to point this out because it also, Linda's question didn't ask this, but it implies it to me, or it raises another question that I want to bring up, which is, this tenet system is saying there is such a thing, at which actually the quote I gave by Dignaga, right? Dignaga's quote was, I'm sorry, the one from the Prana Vartika, right? That through, I'm not going to quote it directly, but through inferential cognition, we can know what is factual and what is not factual. And what this school is saying is it's possible to have pramana, valid cognition, that's inferential and therefore conceptual, that you can actually have an incontrovertible, correct understanding of something through inference. The danger is that we often think we're having, we often think we're having a valid conceptual consciousness when we're not, and so it's dangerous, isn't it? But what this is saying is that, I think it's fascinating in a way, is that good good Buddhist practice, let's put it that way, these quotes are implying is that good Buddhist practice is knowing how to doubt, or how to correctly question, maybe is a better way to put it, our own conceptions, in order to eventually come to valid inferential cognitions, so that we can actually know, and also to be able to know what I'm not capable of knowing yet, right? To know there are certain things I can't yet come to a valid inferential cognition of. So then one would know that one has that one is in a state of doubt about a certain thing, and not pretend that one is not. So it's a way of accurately assessing our own. These are tools for more accurately assessing where we're at in relation to the kind of thing you're raising, I think. Yeah.
Can meditation help you make that determination? That's what I keep thinking, that
Yes.
meditation is going to get me into the ability to make a correct imputation of reality, whatever, how the puzzle pieces fit together.
I think it's supposed to. That's what part of meditation is, and actually, I'll just share, like, you think about it this way too. When you said that, it made me remember, like, the Dalai Lama often has this joke, he says, right, where he talks about, which is, he's getting at this, I think he's getting at something like what you're saying, where he says, he kind of teases, he says, Buddhist traditions that don't have much study of pramana, he makes a joke, he says they're like an elderly person with no teeth who's trying to eat, where they can only eat soft food. If they try to eat something hard, well, you can't chew it, And then he says, whereas the study of pramana is like having healthy, strong teeth. You can eat, you can chew, you can chew through things. And what he's getting at in a way is like that. He's getting at, I think, something like what you're asking, which is the more he's suggesting this idea that the more you've studied pramana and practiced it, the more you can analyze and think through the difficult topics and sort of come to a correct conclusion. Whereas if you haven't, he's suggesting, then you have to just stay with something very easy, and or you'll get it wrong in a way, because it's not easy. Like, for ordinary people, it's really not easy to get things right. And which we can see. I mean, and it's like, it's all of us, right? That's why there's so many, that's part of why there's so many problems in the world, is that we get things wrong. So I think that's what pramana is for, in a way, is that to meditate, to do analytical meditation using pramana is in a way, that's exactly what you're getting. Yeah, is to recognize when am I wrong, and then how do I come to a correct conclusion. That's what the purpose is, I think, to some extent. Well, and that's what that quote is saying, isn't it? Right? Through inferential cognition, to discern what is factual and what is not. So that's, I think that's Dharmakirti says it that way. So I think I'm not just making it up. And then Larry has his hand up.
Yeah, I'm going to add confusion to the confusion already. So, no, I'm listening to people talk about philosophical theories that we would study in universities and all that. And after decades of studying that, I'm confused enough. So, but, it sounds like students asking the same question, and you're the teacher of Buddhism, and you can't take multiple philosophical theories and try to apply a solution using those three. You can only use one. And Buddhism is the solution that we're talking about. In my limited studies of Buddhism, I'm not qualified to give any answers. You can do that much better, but you're giving the answer. And meditation is the answer that I was thinking when, I think it was Lynn that mentioned it, that is the answer to getting, that is the method to get the answer we're looking for. But when you start asking, the catch is when you use the word right. If we're going to get the right answer, now we're questioning what's right. And as I understand Buddhism correctly, that's what we're ultimately seeking through enlightenment, is to get to right. We're meditating, we're looking for guidance, not only through the meditation, but through the teachings that we study. And as we progress over time, and through different reincarnations that occur, at some point that, and I'll use the air quotes of right, we'll know at enlightenment what that is. But we're not going to necessarily be able to quantify what right is now. Best we can do is what you're doing, is listening to the teachings, continue the studying, and meditate on that. The other philosophical theories are good to work with if you want to be a philosopher. I don't encourage it if you hope to make a living doing it, but that's where the other theories are at, and that's not directly related. It sounds like a lot of those theories are in Buddhism, which surprises me a lot, but they are. But you can't mix and match them and come up with the answer you want, not knowing what the right answer is. And that's what we're, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what we ultimately seek, is enlightenment in order to do that. And part of the way we do that is through meditation. And I'll stop before I get it more confused. So.
Well, I mean, I'll ask one thing back, like, because I mean, to some extent, yes, of course, right, like that's correct. And at the same time, I guess, like, well, I'll go back to the quote here, like, you know, part of what, yeah, so yes, and though, I guess I'll say it this way, and part of meditation, though, in the sense, yeah, I mean, there's a lot, actually, if you look at, like, whether you look in the Lamrim, right, like the Lamrim text on the stages of the path to enlightenment, or, you know, or various other texts, like Nagarjuna's texts, or Maitreya's, or Asanga's, that a good deal of that, a good deal of what meditation is, in that sense, along the path, is analyzing. Actually, is doing this kind of contemplative analysis in order to come to. And actually, I'll point this out, like, because, you know, I'll give an example from Chandra Kirti, you know, for example. And he's not a Sartantrika, but I'll just give an example. Like, he makes, and Nagarjuna makes the same point, actually. Like, what they say actually is, like, that you have to, if you want to eventually, they make the point, they say, Chandra Kirti says this, he says, if you want to eventually understand the ultimate view of emptiness in meditation, he makes a point, he says, first you have to come to a correct conclusion recognizing impermanence. You know, and he says, and we grasp at things as if they're permanent. And so Chandra Kirti says, a person, he doesn't use his exact words, I'm paraphrasing, but he basically says, you know, somebody who thinks that, who's still grasping at things as if they have a permanence to them, is not, you know, is not yet suitable, in a way, to, as somebody who could understand the most subtle view of emptiness. So one has to first contemplate, right, and recognize the truth of impermanence. And he says, that's correct, you know, like, and he makes a point, he says, grasping at impermanent things as if they're permanent is wrong, and that's in the sense that we're using it, a wrong consciousness. And recognizing the truth of impermanence is right, is correct, you know, because all conditioned things are impermanent. You know, all things that arise due to causes and conditions are impermanent. That's a correct, valid, inferential cognition that one can come to, and as long as one doesn't have that, one is incorrect. So, like, in that sense, you know, that is part of meditation, and what they're getting at, what Chandra Kirti is saying in that example, which on that point Tiknaga and Dharmakirti would agree, is that one has to use inferential reasoning to come to correct understandings on certain core points of Buddhist practice. For example, impermanence is an example of that, in order to become somebody who is then capable of the next insight, and then the next insight, and eventually to, you know, understanding emptiness, for example, and so on. So does that make sense? So, like, so they're saying that part of that practice is this kind of inferential valid cognition about, you know, sort of, I guess I would almost say spiritually important truths about, you know, or spiritually important, or there's truths that are important for practice. Maybe that's the best way to put it. That's more accurate.
I agree with that. And I guess I would add to that is that for myself, I'll use myself as an example. I'm trained in philosophy, so I have different theories that I understand. And when I meditate, I've listened to you, I've studied under you and others, and I've learned from them. So I have limited knowledge of how to analyze as a Buddhist, and I have much more knowledge of how to analyze as a philosopher. So when I meditate, that's what I use. Doesn't mean it's right, and it may be confusing, but I'm thinking that over the time that we continue to meditate, we take the tools that we have available to us through your teaching, through other teaching that we have, that will become clearer as we evolve. And it's not something that's going to happen soon or quick. And the discussion like we're having, I think maybe will help people to understand better how when they meditate, they're going to analyze themselves. Each one of us will, with what we're able to do, and come up with something. And that's where I have to stop, because I'm limited in how far I've gone with Buddhism and meditation and learning. And then I continue to listen to people like you and others that we have the opportunity to listen to that have studied for a long time, and compare what I think I've learned with the knowledge I've gained now. And then I'll continue doing that as long as I can.
That's the job, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think
You're right.
Yeah, I agree.
But anyway, thank you for that. I just wanted to add that. So
no, I found it interesting. Yeah, other comments or questions before still a little bit of time to go on. But. So anyway, so you see how these ideas, I hope people are starting to get a sense of, first of all, the practice, even though these are kind of, they're maybe a little unfamiliar and technical, they're practical is one point, right? They're very practical for meditation, actually. But I'll just go on a little bit more in the text just to make sure we didn't miss anything. Yeah. So it says here, the appearing object, right, of a particular awareness and the apprehended object of that awareness are synonymous. So they're just saying that's another term, right? Apprehended object and appearing object are synonyms. And remember what I just said earlier. So that means that synonyms means they have those 8 pervasions, right? Wherever one appears, the other appears. Wherever one doesn't appear, that other won't appear. Whenever one appears, they, and so on. There's a technical definition for synonyms even, but that's what that's getting at. Then it says, this is I already addressed, but it says here, whatever is an established base. Established base is a Buddhist term for existent, right? An existent thing. So whatever is an established base is necessarily an appearing object, right? So I already said that. There aren't existents that don't appear to awareness. Because part of the definition of what does it mean for something to be an existent is that it appears to awareness. So it says here, this is because whatever is a thing is necessarily an appearing object of a direct perceiver, right? So whatever a thing, and thing means functioning thing. Like I was using that term, functioning thing, impermanent thing. And then it says, and whatever is permanent, and permanent here doesn't mean last for, I've said this before, but in case you haven't heard, like permanent in the Buddhist context doesn't mean eternal. Permanent just in this context, in Tibetan, me takpa me is a negative. So it'd be like impermanent, means something that changes instant by instant. So here, whatever is permanent, permanent means fixed or not changing instant by instant. So that's what permanent means, just to be clear. Because I think the English word is a little confusing. To me, when I hear the word permanent outside of the Buddhist context, I think of like, I don't know, something that would last for all eternity, and that's not what's meant. So anyway, it says, whatever is permanent is necessarily the appearing object of a conceptual consciousness, right? And that's what we get at. So that because mental images don't change instant by instant, right? So the way of getting at, so in other words, so what appears to a conceptual consciousness is something that's a mental image, therefore it's permanent in this sense of the word. Then it says the first reason is established because appearing object of a direct perceiver, apprehended object of a direct perceiver, and thing are synonymous, right? So anyway, I think that's pretty clear. Functioning thing, a functioning thing is what appears to a direct perceiver and is therefore the apprehended or appearing object. Those are synonyms anyway, to a direct perceiver. Furthermore, it follows that whatever is a thing must be the appearing object of a direct perceiver, because whatever is a thing must be that which is realized in a manifest manner by a direct perceiver. And I already said that. That's the definition of a thing, right? A functioning thing. It's that which can be directly perceived. The second basic reason i.e., whatever is permanent is necessarily the appearing object of a conceptual consciousness, is established because the appearing object of a conceptual consciousness, the apprehended object of a conceptual consciousness, and permanent phenomena are synonymous, right? And so again, permanent in the sense I used it, right? So, and it's just saying because what appears to a conceptual consciousness, a mental image, and mental images are fixed. They're not, I mean, they're fixed in the sense that they don't change instant by instant. Then it says, also object, now we're getting at the object of engagement thing, right? Object of engagement of a direct perceiver and object of the mode of apprehension of a direct perceiver are synonymous. So it's just another term, object of engagement, mode of apprehension, object of the mode of apprehension of a direct perceiver is a synonym for object of engagement of a direct perceiver. They're just giving you different terms that are going to sometimes appear in text and just describing what they're defining what they are, so you know. And a lot of them are synonyms. Then it says, this is where determined object of thought, object of engagement of thought, and the mode of apprehension of thought are synonymous. And then, yeah, good, there's time. I want to cover, whatever is an established base is necessarily the object of the mode of apprehension of both a conceptual and a non-conceptual consciousness. Then it says, whatever is the object of the mode of apprehension of a thought consciousness, apprehending it is not necessarily an object of the mode of apprehension of thought. Is that clear? It's challenging. We'll get into it. And then he says, this is because the horns of a rabbit are not the object of the mode of apprehension of thought. This follows because the horns of a rabbit are not an object of thought, which again, in English sounds very confusing, isn't it? Because in a way, what does that mean? The horns of a rabbit are not an object of thought when we're thinking about them literally as we're reading it, right? It says, this is because the horns of a rabbit are not an object of awareness, which is because horns of a rabbit are not that which is suitable to be an object of awareness. It follows that the subject, the horns of a rabbit, is the object of the mode of apprehension of a thought, conscious apprehending it because of being selfless. What's he talking about? I just want to we'll conclude with this because this is a confusing passage, I felt, but it's actually kind of fun if you get into what it means. So first thing to understand this is, I've already said this first part, right? Conceptual consciousnesses apprehend both existent and non-existent phenomena, right? And what's an example of actually, I'll just ask you, I gave many. What's an example of a conceptual consciousness apprehending an existent phenomenon? If I think of my toothbrush, right? If I think of a pen, if I think of actually, if I if I look away from the screen and I think of Linda Dane's glasses, right? That's, I just saw them and I closed my eyes. Now I have a mental image of them and I think, oh, Linda's wearing glasses. That would be a conceptual consciousness, right? Apprehending an existent phenomenon. Right? What's an example of a conceptual consciousness apprehending a non-existent phenomenon? He gives an example here, horns of a rabbit, right? Rabbits don't have horns. So if I think, oh, the horns of a rabbit, that would be a conceptual consciousness apprehending a non-existent phenomenon, right? A non-existent. What's another really, why are they raising this? I just want to point out, what's a humongously important example of a conceptual consciousness apprehending a non-existent? An example of that would be my conceptual consciousness grasping at a self-sufficient, substantially existent self of person, right? That is the most important for liberation, right? According to this tenet system, that's humongously important example of a conceptual consciousness that's apprehending a non-existent. And that conceptual consciousness apprehending a non-existent, right? Self-sufficient, substantially existent self, according to this tenet system, is the cause of suffering. So this is a really important point. You could go, why is he talking about horns of a rabbit here? He's using horns of a rabbit because it's easier. What they really want to get at eventually is self-grasping, right? So now I'm going to describe the terms here. So now we can explain the meaning here. So for something to be an object of a conceptual consciousness, it has to exist, right? On the other hand, when we say the object of a conceptual consciousness apprehending it, that object does not have to exist. Because conceptual consciousnesses can apprehend both existent and non-existence. Right? So now I'm going to say it very carefully here. To be an object of a conceptual consciousness, it must exist. Right? And my example is Linda's glasses or my toothbrush. It's not in the room, but it's an object of conceptual consciousness and it exists. Right? But to be an object of a conceptual consciousness apprehending it, it does not need to exist. Right? And that means sometimes conceptual consciousnesses do apprehend mental images, right? But they don't correlate to anything that actually exists as a thing. And do you get how that's really, really important, right? Yeah, that's humongously important, right? We superimpose, so like sometimes, and you get the point here though, this isn't saying, I just want to point out, this is not saying, therefore, you get it. This is not, I hope you get it very clearly. This is not saying that all conceptuality is wrong, right? It's saying, no, sometimes conceptual things get at actually existent phenomena, right? So it's not saying, sometimes Buddhists think that, sometimes people, not really Buddhists, but people who think about Buddhism or write silly jokes about Buddhism or something, you know, seem to have this idea that all Buddhists are saying all conceptuality is wrong. No, right? Buddhism is saying the object of a conceptual consciousness can exist, you know, sometimes they do exist, right? And then it's not a wrong consciousness. But it's really important that sometimes they don't exist. And so again, I want to point this out. I'm going to read my own quote again. It's actually a quote from a Geshe. To be the object of a conceptual consciousness, it must exist. But to be the object of a conceptual consciousness apprehending it, it does not need to exist. And that means, like, so for example, the horns of a rabbit exist for this conceptual consciousness apprehending them, but they don't exist. And does that make sense? So they, in other words, and pause there, like, because we're going to conclude at this point anyway. Do you get the significance of that? Like, I just want to point out, right? Like, actually, have you ever argued with somebody where you knew, where you were actually, I mean, looking back, you were correct and they were wrong, right? It happens all the time, you know, or sometimes I've been, you know, you're the one wrong, right? But like, there is where it exists for your consciousness, but it doesn't exist, right? And I want to point out a few things. One is, like, it's really weird, isn't it? Because, like, let's say it right, like, actually, how many times have you witnessed somebody screaming at somebody else? Like, you know, shouting and enraged because their conceptual consciousness, for their conceptual consciousness apprehending it, for that conceptual consciousness apprehending it, something existed, but it didn't exist, right? But it existed for their conceptual consciousness, and they started, you know, and they were screaming at somebody else because for their conceptual consciousness it existed, even though it doesn't exist. You get how important that is, right? And like, my gosh, you know, like if you actually, I just want to say, I'm just pausing to contemplate this myself, and like, people have wasted entire lives over this, right? Over a conceptual consciousness for apprehending something that's not, that the thing exists for their conceptual consciousness but doesn't actually exist, right? Like, you know, and like, you know, fights have happened over this, murders have happened over this, like, you know, wars have happened over this. You know, samsara happens over, and actually the entirety of samsara, according to this tenet system, happens over this, right? In other words, so samsara happens because, and I remember, I'll just share this story and then, well, actually, yeah, I'll share a story very briefly and I'll answer, and then Larry's question. I remember one time I was talking, like, one time, Yume Kensho Rinpoche, I was having a conversation with him about this topic one day, about empty, it was actually not from this tenet system's perspective, but it was the same point. We were saying, you know, for the consciousness, well, I'll put it this way, I'll put it in the terms of this tenet system. For the consciousness grasping at self-existence, self-existence exists to that consciousness, right? So there's a consciousness that's grasping at itself. And then Kensho Rinpoche was saying, at a certain point in meditation, you're doing analysis, right? And then he says, he made this point, he said, you have to actually experientially in yourself, you cut off and destroy that mental image that's of something that doesn't exist. And at the same moment, the consciousness that was grasping at that also ceases. And what continues is the consciousness, a different consciousness in yourself that recognizes, that was analyzing and that saw it's false, right? Because for us, right, I just want to go back, to be the object of a conceptual conscious apprehending it, like, so something can, anyways, what's this, right? For a conceptual consciousness that's apprehending it, a non-existent thing exists, right? And so for us, if we want to gain wisdom, we have to experientially through analysis, through reasoning, cut off both those wrong, the consciousness that grasp at those things and the objects of those consciousnesses. And there's actually a stopping of that. Of course, your own consciousness continues, but it's a different consciousness that doesn't grasp at such a false object. And so this is humongously, you know, so you could, when we read that quote, I think all of us, I think when I first read it too, I thought, oh my goodness, what's he talking about? It doesn't make, I had to stop and think about it and then, you know, read the commentary and contemplate more. But this is getting at something humongously, this is getting at how do you have liberation, right? But it's also getting at, you know, when you debate with yourself or when you debate with somebody else, right? Like, again, it's like the thing doesn't exist, but to that consciousness it exists. And that's really hard, isn't it? It's hard to give up, you know, something that exists to our consciousness, even though sometimes what exists to our consciousness doesn't exist, is what it's saying. Larry.
Yeah, you've been consistent using the word conceive all along, which helped me to better understand it, because there's a fine line, very close resemblance of conception and perception. And conception is what we're doing here, if I understand correctly. And that's more something that's done by the mind. We form something in the mind that doesn't exist, but it exists in the mind to us. And I think that's kind of what you said a while ago. The perception of something is something that I would see. The pen that you were talking about, I see it, and then I form a theory based on that. That's different. It's just the linguistics of the word, the meanings of the word, what they mean. And that's why the words are so critical, not to mention the translation of words like you showed a while ago with Tibetan to English, that just a slight difference in the translation. If we don't speak the language, you have to rely on someone that does, and their correct interpretation and application to what we're talking about. So I just wanted to add that because that conception was what you've been talking about. And that does, to me, answer the, you know, the issue that has been brought up, you know, a while ago about what that is. And it's something that we conceive in the mind. It's not there. The pencil isn't there, but I know pencil in the mind, and it exists for me, but it doesn't exist to you or in my hand or anything. So hopefully that didn't confuse it more. So
no, I think that's good. Yeah, and it is important. Yeah, that's why I've been trying to be. Yeah, I am trying to be careful. Like, so, yeah, we'll get into more next class. Actually, we'll get into more detail about, you know, this topic that you're raising of, you know, they'll call it direct perceivers and inferential, you know, so on. But yes, yeah, it's really important distinction to make between direct, especially to make a distinction between, as we're doing today, between direct perception and conceptual knowers. Yeah, conceptions, conceptual knowers. That they're very different ways of knowing, and they're both ways of knowing, but they're different ways of knowing. Yeah. Wow. Well, great. Well, I know we got to stop in a minute. I just want to say to conclude, like, one is, you know, so we'll continue on with this class, and, you know, so, and I want to just say a couple quick things. Like, one is, you know, so there are two, yeah, I said this already at the beginning a little bit, but there are two halves to this whole module. So that, you know, we call it mind and awareness, but the first half is this, right, which is, you know, really, I think it was like low ring, you know, so they're calling it awareness and knowers, which comes from pramana. And my point is just, this is the first half, and the second half will be about mind and mental factors, like, so knowing being able to introspect, to know what's a virtuous and a non-virtuous mental factor, what's a neutral mental factor, because again, those have practical implications for practice. And you know, my hope, I just want to say, you know, my hope, you know, like, obviously, you know, Geshe knows I'm very aware that, like, you know, Laurent Geshe used to spend years debating in the monastery, know more about these topics than I do, for sure, because they spend years debating it. But my hope is that we can get a good basic understanding of what is this and of how do you apply it for practice. That's my focus, you know, and this is what are these core concepts and how do you apply them in your practice for meditation and for contemplation. And what I hope you'll get, in a way, which I think is true, and this has been what's benefited me humongously. One is it gives you a guideline for seeing where you're at in your own practice, or how am I doing at understanding these topics. And later I used to have this idea, like, because you would hear this term realization, oh, somebody gained realization. What is that? You know, and these topics go, okay, no, there's a gradual process that happens, and you can tell where you're at in that process on any given topic. And then you can apply it. And like, if you go back to the stages of the path to enlightenment, you can actually say, like, okay, regarding this topic, where am I at? How well do I understand it in my own self? Do I have a valid cognition of it? Or do I have a belief about it? Or do I have some kind of, you know, what is my understanding of that? And how can I progress next in understanding it? So I think, like, these, I hope that what you'll get out of this series of classes is a basic understanding of these terms and ideas, but also a way of applying them so that when you do Lamrim or you do some other practice, whatever practice you want to do, you meditate on emptiness or impermanence or Bodhichitta, that you can actually check for yourself. Okay, where is my own understanding of this? You know, and how good is it? And then also the other point is what we were talking about today a little bit too, which is, and then also if you're caught up in some, you know, just this week something happened, like where I was part of a group and they were having a conflict, and there was, like, I was feeling, you know, sad about it. There was a conflict between some people and I was feeling sad about sort of seeing what was happening. And then I was able to stop and go, oh, wait a second. Like, this is I'm not sad about, like, right this moment, I'm not sad about what's happening between them. I'm sad about my concept of what's happening between them. And is my concept accurate about what's happening between them? You know, and I'm reacting now to my own concepts here, right? And how am I doing that and why? And is that helpful to them or to me? And these, you know, and to differentiate, because I wasn't differentiate, right? We don't differentiate. We just go, oh, this is so upsetting. Well, what's upsetting? Is it my concept? Is it what's actually happening? Do I know what's happening? Is my concept of what's happening accurate to what's actually happening? And for which person? Because maybe each of them is perceiving it differently, and so on. You see what I'm getting at there? So these are useful both in terms of understanding your meditations, but also in real life. Like, if you're upset about a coworker, are you upset about the coworker, or are you upset about your concept of the coworker? And is your concept of the coworker accurate or not accurate, and so on? Anyway, there are a lot of things that you can apply from this, I hope. And I hope that's what you'll get out of it, is my point. Yeah. But we should do a dedication. And then, you know, the other classes, I sent out a schedule. Gabe's here, and the website's, I want to acknowledge that. The website's been down, and Gabe is building a new website for us. He's in class here. So the class schedule will be up there. But if anybody needs, you know, right now we're putting out, I guess I put it up on Facebook page, our Facebook page, and it's going out on the email from Venerable Dundrup that he sends out that. But if you are struggling to get any information, the website will be up, Gabe, you said probably by in a few weeks or something, right?
Yeah, that's what we're hoping for, Lauren. Couple more weeks.
A couple more. Okay, so if you're struggling with it, if people have a question until then, feel free to email me directly, or Varahi, I guess, is okay if they email you, because Varahi has the spc@guyasamaja.org email address, so you can email her. Usually, if you have questions about the text, or questions about schedule, or questions about Zoom or something, feel free to email either of us, and then the website will be back up in a few weeks. But we should do our dedication though. So okay. We usually do at least two. So the Supreme Jewel, Bodhichitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In this snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara's end. And do one more. Through these merits, which are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, may the I, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, in order to lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. Well, thanks, everybody. Great questions and great discussion.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you, Lauren.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. See you next class.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren.
Oh, thanks.